So after hearing the chief's call about, recommending the police services, the recommendations to amend the Police Services Act, I'm wondering why you think Chief Bauer's recommendations, um, why you don't think, rather, Chief Bauer's recommendations are sufficient.
Right. You know what? In fact, when I heard the chief's recommendations, I found them actually quite peculiar. That, um, the establishment of a code of conduct or changes to legislation to publicize disciplinary action were the kinds of outcomes coming out of this particular case. Because this particular case is not an example of code of conduct violations. This case is an example of officers engaged in criminal behavior while on the job, crimes that shouldn't require a code of conduct in order for officers not to engage in crimes while they're on the job. So there's something about the fact that, you know, the suggestion that if there was a kind of code of conduct, that this behavior perhaps wouldn't have happened, but this behavior shouldn't be happening at all. It is Officers should not be committing crimes while on the job. And that is what is sort of the baseline, I think, here, is that this behavior shouldn't be happening at all. And the fact that it has been happening, at least for almost a decade, it seems, suggests that there are bigger issues internal to the organization that the organization really needs to tackle.
We understand the police chief is planning a more detailed discussion with the justice minister. So we heard some of the recommendations that were at the press conference last week. But what else might you suggest is discussed or recommended? Or is the point here that it shouldn't be the police that are really involved in the oversight of what's happening here?
Right. I think there are a lot of layers there where the police are involved in, institutional transformation when they are the institution that has struggled at least for 8 years or so to tackle these kinds of issues. So it is peculiar that there is this kind of level of trust in the police to change their ways or to make improvements when the police themselves have demonstrated an inability to do that. And so I think what we have to tackle fundamentally is the kind of culture that pervades policing. This is not just an issue of an individual police officer engaged in individual forms of misconduct or committing crimes. It's also a culture that allows for officers to commit crimes for 8 years before having it come to light. A culture that is quite top down, a culture that is quite insular, and a culture that, unfortunately, loyalty at times allows for these kinds of behaviors to go unreported.
I'm going to dig into that with you, that culture piece, in a moment. I just
Mm-hmm.
want to say allegedly commit crimes, because these we're talking about the going back 8 years to 2016. Of course, the charges date back to 2016. They've not been proven in a court of law. I do wonder, though, where you look at cases where charges have been proven and it's sort of gone unreported for all of these years. I mean, in the end, it was members of the service were part of. We don't have a ton of detail, but we know members of the police service did come forward and bring some of this to light. So this is going to speak to culture, right? Like what it takes to come forward, I suppose. But I wonder, how does it happen? That something would go under the radar, so to speak, for
Yeah.
so long, that kind of activity in a service.
Right. And I think these are really great questions because policing is a kind of peculiar organization. On the one hand, and I think that the peculiarities contribute to the outcomes that we're seeing. On the one hand, you have an organization that is quite, as I was saying, top down, that is quite organized around loyalty, around deference to authority, around obeying orders, and above all, having the back of your fellow officers, right? And so in a culture like that, coupled with a lack of transparency, visibility from the outside looking in, it creates a kind of atmosphere where individuals with their high levels of discretion can engage in behaviors that are not consistent with the policies or the expectations of the organizations. And perhaps because of this loyalty piece, Other officers are willing to also either go along or at least say nothing when these kinds of behaviors happen. So on the one side, you have that. And on the other side, what you have is within that same structure, a kind of disincentive to report because reporting is often seen as disloyal behavior that compromises your relationships with your colleagues. Because if you are going to report on one officer, it might be the case that you will report on me next, for example, right? And so when you have a culture where there isn't a lot of visibility and there are disincentives for coming forward, it creates a kind of environment where behaviors that shouldn't happen can happen for a
Well,
prolonged period of time.
I want to interject here. What do you mean by disincentives for coming forward? How does that come out culturally, or what might be the thinking there by an officer who's hesitant to come forward, for example?
Right. Because, I mean, officers, also want to manage their own careers. They may want to progress. They may want to have promotions. And in policing, what is key is your relationships with your colleagues, with your superiors, with your coworkers. And part of establishing those strong relationships means being loyal and being, having the trust of your fellow officers. If your fellow officers don't trust you and don't want to work with you, that becomes a huge problem, right? And so there are officers who I suspect may have been aware of some of this behavior, but were reluctant to come forward because they may not have felt like they would be believed by their superiors, and that coming forward would compromise their own careers, their own jobs, whether that's formally or informally through not having partners who want to work with you. So there is a cost to be paid for those who come forward.
So most people entering the police profession, they enter it with the best intentions. What needs to change for that to be the dominant culture in police departments?
hmm I think that is true. That most folks who do come into policing want to do public service and want to do it legitimately, right? I think what needs to happen is that what we need to do is ensure that we have sort of systems in place where when misconduct is seen, that there are not only consequences, but that those consequences, are understood as making policing better, not as a kind of outside threat to the organization, but that the commitment of police should be first and foremost to public service,
So who
right,
lead?
and to ensuring that their job is done effectively.
So we have 2 minutes left, and I need to tackle two big things. One of them is who should lead the change then of the culture.
Mm. This is a really good question. And again, I've said, I don't believe that the police should sort of lead this sort of endeavor. And in fact, my belief is this: is that if we are at a time where not only concerns about police behavior, police conduct are being asked, but where broader questions are being asked about the very nature of policing, the very ways in which we deliver public safety to our communities. If those questions are being asked, perhaps this is the perfect time to start from scratch and think about, well, how do we deliver public safety to our communities? How do we ensure that we meet the needs most effectively? What kind of organizations do we need to do that? And what kind of integrity, accountability structures do we need to put in place for that to happen, right? Then we can start with tinkering with the organization and changing this. But I think this is an opportunity for us to actually reimagine how we do what we do in the process of keeping people safe. And so I would hope that we don't miss the opportunity to do perhaps something bigger if in fact we are going to have this whole scale, organizational reordering.
We will have to leave our conversation there, and I'm sure we'll talk again. Thank you very much for your time today.
No problem. Thank you.
That is Timothy Bryan, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. He researches policing of hate crime and criminal justice reform. We did put in a request to speak with, I put in a request to speak with the police chief here in Winnipeg, and we are hoping that we'll be able to talk to him at some point. We have been told that he wants to be in more detailed discussions with the Justice Minister before he publicly comments again. He, of course, was part of that press conference last week. If you want to read CBC's coverage of this story, cbc.ca/Manitoba is where you can find our coverage.